Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this NLA Project in Practice webinar focusing on Holbein Gardens this morning. So my name is Nicola. I'm Head of Communications here at NLA, and I am delighted to be chairing this webinar this morning. So we are NLA, we are London's built environment community, and for access to hundreds of events, research reports, exhibitions, and business critical industry insights, you can become a member of NLA at nla.london online for as little as £20 a month. So please do check it out online. But this morning, our Project in Practice webinar is focusing on Holbein Gardens. So a little bit about the Project in Practice series. They are an opportunity to focus on a single exemplar London project and investigate the technical aspects of its design, specification, and delivery. So this webinar this morning brings together the team of client developers, architects, and engineers behind Holbein Gardens to present in detail the processes and methods behind this exemplar project, guided by circular principles. This event is part of our Net Zero programme, and Holbein Gardens has been selected from our recent NLA report, Circular London, Building a Renewable City, which was published earlier this year. So in a circular economy, designing for maintenance, adaptability, and disassembly requires a holistic understanding of buildings and their material elements. Holbein Gardens epitomises these circular principles, retaining 93% of the existing structure, a 1980s commercial building, diverting 99% of site waste from landfill, and pioneering the direct reuse of structural steel in London. So after our presentations, there will be an opportunity to ask our speakers some questions at the end. So please do use the Q&A tool on Zoom on your screen to send your questions in. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Philip George, the Project Director at Grosvenor. So over to you, Philip.
Thanks, Nicola, and to those who joined the series today. I'm Philip George. I'm a project director within Grosvenor, and with a wider team, I've been responsible for the development of Holbein Gardens. So I'll make a short introduction to the project, and Jonathan at Bar Gazette, as our architect, will better cover aspects around our ambition through design and progressive workplace later in the session. And so for this morning, I'll focus more on our environmental journey and conclude briefly with our learnings through the life of the project. Holbein Gardens is a redevelopment and single-storey extension of a 1980s office building, as Nicola said, off of adjacent to Sloane Square Tube station. And has created 25,000 square foot of modern and progressive workplace, and it's Grosvenor's first net zero office development. If I could get to, I think, the next slide, or the yes, that's great, thank you. As a 1980s build, it had I guess many good fundamentals, particularly with its structure and its structural capacity, and also the proportions of the building. But over 35 years, it hadn't had any capital investment at all. It was very dated, both on the inside and the outside. It was very dull, and it was really drab, and we had poor income coming from it. So the building wasn't contributing positively at all to with financial returns or in placemaking terms. And as with all of our development projects and refit opportunities, our key priorities, and as we track performance metrics over three key areas, which we summarize as financial, environmental, and social value. So we measure our business plan, and we look for business approvals and business commitments over those three key areas, and then we measure and monitor the project as we go through the delivery of that against those three areas, all the way through to outturn. So having concluded a series of feasibility studies on 7 Holbein Place with the team, across different use sectors, and considering a range of interventions, all the way from new builds and the higher level extensions down to low, really low levels of refurbishment. We opted to maintain the use as offices, undertake a deep retrofit and extend upwards through the additional floor to increase net area by 25%. I think we might go to the next slide after this. Thank you. Noting it was, the building is completed now, it completed in the summer of this year, and it was conceived in 2019 as the previous income was about to expire. And that meant that it was designed, approved, consulted on, went through the planning process, got consented and was procured through the start and the middle of the COVID pandemic period. So a very different way of working for us all. But also at that time, at the start of 2020, that became a turning point for Grosvenor, as at that time we published some of the most stretching sustainability goals in the sector, and our business ambition became particularly high in that regard. Within that, we produced a sustainable development brief, which articulates our 2030 goals and aspirations, but also provides guidance for us and our consultant teams across our development projects as to how we can work to achieve this. And the sustainable development brief is also backed up by an environmental scorecard, and that scorecard we use on a project basis to manage and monitor, and it's also used on a portfolio basis to track and to report. And this is the Holbein Gardens was managed, of course, on that basis, and this is the whole Holbein Gardens scorecard that you can see here. And that covers really 4 key areas: embodied carbon, operational carbon, nature, and waste. And I'll cover each of these in terms of our targets and where we ended up very briefly. So on the next slide, with embodied carbon as a retrofit project and through thoughtful design and procurement, we've been able to really drive down embedded energy, extending the building upwards through the use of reclaimed steel and cross-laminated timber. We've used 25,000 square foot of reclaimed or second-hand raised access floor tiles, and we've used, where possible, reclaimed brickwork. So having reduced carbon as much as possible per UK Green Building Council criteria, the remaining carbon, in this case of about 350 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared, has now been offset using a verified accreditation scheme. With embodied carbon on the next slide, sorry, with operational carbon and operational energy, which is to reduce energy through consumption, we've specified the building as all electric. We procure, as we do across the wider estate, green energy. We've specified openable windows to allow mixed mode and natural ventilation on appropriate days. We've specified an intelligent BMS system, lighting circuits, and enhanced sub-metering. And all of that, of course, enables data to monitor electricity, heat consumption, lighting, as well as supporting additional power through electricity generation through solar PVs, in this case, on the roof. With the next slide, with nature, in this case, the existing building actually did offer some really good opportunities to really drive the benefits of biodiversity and greening. And so there's some really good opportunities here. And our targets have been very well met. We were able to carry out extensive landscaping to the frontage with the front garden that you can just see here, and also 2 green walls adjacent to the reception area, and extensive landscaping to the roof terrace, which was part of the additional top floor extension. And we've had really great feedback. We've all got photos as we go through the presentation, and those that have seen it say it looks really, really good as well. With waste, which is our last slide on our environmental scorecard, 99% of waste has been diverted from landfill through our contractor commitments and our supply chain charter, and also through legal contracts that we're now able to commit responsible and reliable contractors, in this case Blenheim House Construction, to. Sustainability can often get very technical and very complicated quickly, so the next slide just shows very simply an infographic which we use, and of course the industry uses very well, particularly to help inform and enthuse. And I won't run through these because we're all going to cover most of these. The next slide summarizes third-party accreditations, which we use to support the credibility of what we're doing. And in this case, Holbein Gardens has achieved a NABERS 4.5 star rating. It's BREEAM Outstanding, well enabled, with Wired Score Gold, and we've achieved an EPC A rating. With what I think is the last slide, our insight and lessons learned through Holbein Gardens over the last 3 years. I won't summarise all of these, and some of them look or sound very obvious. So, for example, I think making a dedicated line in the budget for sustainability primarily is there to support innovation as well as sustainability. And that's on top of the core work, the design, the M&E, the structural team, the sustainability team, and the wider consultant team do. We have experienced the challenge of using reclaimed materials, in particular warranties, insurance provisions, procurement, the time to select, to repair and make good and procure, but also most importantly, the availability, or should I say, the shortage that we're hearing about now from the market around the availability of reclaimed materials as the market picks up to look better, to look to do better around embodied carbon. With sophisticated systems that we're all adopting now to drive data, to inform energy use, to try and drive down operational efficiencies and reduce energy consumption, then we're finding that data is not always, the access to the systems and that data is not always that simple. So how can we simplify access to that data so that a wide range of people and teams can see that and they can analyze it in a simple way? Is an interesting challenge. And I think this certainly goes with all projects, but particularly so with those where you're wanting to push boundaries, you're wanting to really set high ambition around environmental performance and innovation. Selecting the right team to go on the journey with you to adapt to those new practices, to bring forward ideas, to be comfortable to bring forward new ideas, however radical they are, and to help drive innovation and success for us, for the project, for the industry, for the built environment. And of course, lastly, we can't do that alone. It is only with progressive teams, good ideas and shared learning that we'll be able to make good progress. So there's a couple of photos, I think. There's plenty of photos as we go through it, so I'm not going to dwell on any of these. We'll just click through before I hand over to William.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Philip. That's a really great introduction to the project from your perspective as the client and developer, so I'll enjoy letting these photos roll. We will now hear from HTS, the engineers working on the project. So I'd like to welcome William Wallace, the structural engineer at HTS, who is kindly stepping in last minute to present on behalf of his colleague Laura Batty. So over to you, William, when you're ready.
Hi everyone. Yeah, my name's Will, senior structural engineer at HTS, and I was project engineer on Holbein Gardens from kind of conception right the way through to practical completion. So know the project well. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of the structural work that we did on the project. We removed an existing single-story mansard structure off the top of this 1980s office building. Put 2 stories of steel frame back with CLT infills, as you see there. We did some refiguring of the reception space to make that more welcoming, and also the 2 steel frames you see on either side of the reception wing to the left of that image there to hold the 2 green walls that kind of flank that wing of the building. The contractor was Benham House Construction, and we also worked closely with Cleveland Steel and Tubes, who I'll come on to in some later slides. There's 3 kind of takeaways I'm hoping to get across in this presentation. One is just to generally talk about the refurbishment of the existing building and the extension, and that generally. The second is reclaim materials, specifically reused steel, which was a particular highlight of this project and an exciting kind of field moving forward. And the third is low carbon materials, specifically for us structurally was the CLT panels and some design considerations for those. Next slide, please. So starting with the refurbishment, so we retained lots of the existing building, adding 2 stories on top. We had to justify the additional weight of that coming down the building. So we kind of did standard structural investigations to do that, chipping away at concrete, looking at rebar in the existing building, things like that. The site's made a little bit more complicated by the London Underground district and circle lines, which you can see kind of running around the back of the site just about in the image there. But also interestingly, one of London's lost rivers, the River Westbourne, runs directly, it kind of flies through Sloane Square tube station and then runs under our site, and you can kind of see a big tube under the front of the building, and that carries one of London's old rivers. So the increase in weight on the building, we had to kind of justify that with Thames Water. And then one thing I want to get across on the refurbishment side of things was the reception works. So as you come into the building, the kind of main entrance is on the left, bottom left of that image. We removed the first floor slab to create a double height space, and also a column, which you can just about see, which was removed at ground floor just to generally improve access into the building. So the first point, removal of that first floor slab, it completely transforms the space. If you could go there before and after, it's just a different space altogether. And that area of concrete is kind of really minor when you consider all of the existing structure in the building, all the foundations and stuff. So with well-placed intervention, you could have a big impact. And the second point, the removal of the column, that was actually quite a big bit of structural work. We ended up kind of jacking up the entire building in the same way that you might jack up a car and put in 2 massive steel frames because they were big because they had to support the weight of the building above. So quite a bit of structural work. But again, we were still able to get good embodied carbon figures overall because it was a well-placed bit of intervention. And I think that's it for the refurb side of things. A quick before and after. You can see the improvement in the building and that green wall on the side. Second point to cover is the use of reused steel. So about half of the steel work in the project was from reused sources, and of that, about a third was from the client Grosvenor's donor sites, so other sites they have. We viewed a number of those sites, and after some kind of searching, found steel in the right size and lengths that we could then incorporate into our scheme. And the other 2/3 came from a stockist called Cleveland Steel. They're based in Yorkshire, and they've just got a massive stockpile of steel elements, not dissimilar to the photos you see here. They've also, if you go to the next slide, I think that Cleveland Steel also have loads of tubes from the oil and gas industry, which is worth noting. And I think one thing moving forwards, incorporating those circular sections, I think is an exciting prospect for any project in the future looking to reuse steel. Some points, as a designer, if I'm designing a structural steel frame, I basically I'll have things that I need my steel elements to do. My beams and columns need to be a certain strength to carry the loads that they have. And it's a bit different from designing just a new steel frame, in that I kind of need to build in flexibility so that when I'm searching for steel elements from a stockist or from a donor site, I have the greatest possible chance of getting a match. So I kind of have to build in that flexibility into my design and specification to maximize this, because specifying reusing steel has its challenges, and as Phil says, finding stock is not always easy. So you've got to give yourself the greatest possible chance of getting matches and finding the material. Next slide, please. So this is a visual showing exactly what elements were reused, and the difference. So the red is what we got from Grosvenor Jobs. Green was from Cleveland Steel. Coloured steel is about half the steel used overall. You can see it tends to be the smaller elements, tie beams and some of the columns, which didn't need to be that big. The beams in white are regular new steel, and they're the kind of heavier, shallow sections which were needed. We didn't have a lot of headroom to play with because of planning, and we wanted to maximise floor to ceiling heights to get premium office space. So one big challenge with reused steel is getting big, heavier sections, really. The only heavier section you can get are tubes, which are not really suitable for beams like this. And the third kind of point is low carbon materials. We had CLT infills, and the two cores of the building were, in the existing lower levels, are concrete shear walls, concrete cores. We raised those up in CLT core walls. Those core walls weren't on show. Like on the floor plate, you can see lots of lovely CLT soffits. In the cores, for part of the fire design, we needed to encapsulate all that timber. Unfortunately, we weren't able to put it on show, but it needed to be encapsulated to give the cores the required fire resistance. When you have a CLT flat roof like this, waterproofing is really important. Because with CLT, because it's basically a solid lump of timber with bits of timber laminated over each other, if there is any leaking in the roofing, water can potentially sit there for quite a long time, and you might not know about it. So on this project, we had bulletproof waterproofing system, three lines of defense as part of the roof build-up. And a quick note on fire. Basically, what we do is we demonstrate that in fire resistance period, in this case 60 minutes, the CLT can burn and char for 60 minutes, and after that time there's still enough structural material left to do its job and work structurally. So that's how we justified the exposed CLT soffits. Slide, please. And here we have it, the finished building. Some really nice CLT soffits, and you can see the hybrid construction between the steel and the CLT. Great job to work on overall.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Will. That was a great presentation. It was really interesting learning more about the reused and reclaimed steelwork used for the project. So before we go to our final presentation, I would just like to remind everyone in the audience that we have the audience Q&A tool. So please do enter your questions in the Q&A on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will come around to that towards the end of the webinar. So for our final presentation, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Allwood, Director at Bar Gazettas, the architects behind Holbein Gardens.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Jonathan, Director at Bar Gazettas, Architects for Holbein Gardens. Okay, next slide, please. So Philip talks a bit about the history of the building and the previous tenants. The images here show show how it was when we first came to it. And I think, you know, in design terms, it was kind of certainly a bit of an ugly duckling and very much of its time, and rather unsympathetic to its surroundings. But there was really clear opportunities for transformation that kind of presented themselves the first time we went there. I mean, obviously it's helped by its fantastic location, just adjacent to Sloane Square and the King's Road. But you can see it had really quite generous floor-to-ceiling heights for a building of this age. The plan depth was relatively shallow, so despite the kind of really heavily tinted 1980s glazing, there was still a good amount of daylight penetration into the floor plate. We were pretty sure, though, working with Will, that there was great capacity in the structure for vertical extension, and there was a huge basement space actually that we immediately knew would really lend itself to kind of great end of trip commuter facilities. So all kind of positive from that first site inspection. Next slide, please. Again, and as you've already heard, the brief from Grosvenor was pretty clear. It was to create their most sustainable office building to date. And as Philip touched on as well, we were embarking on the scheme just as Grosvenor's sustainable development brief was being launched, and all of the kind of scorecard and everything that goes with that. And I think for us as a design team, what that did was create a kind of really clear and measurable structure that we could use to navigate all of the decision making and all of the kind of optioneering that was happening at the feasibility stage of the project. And having that structure and that guidance was incredibly important in refining the brief. That structure was based around 9 themes, which are climate resilience, greener spaces, quality places, community, resource use, economy, connection, well-being, and certification. So lots in there. But we were constantly testing our various strategies, options for the building against all of these criteria, looking at the carbon intensity for each one of those options, and refining the brief to get the best fit approach for this building. You know, each when we're retrofitting these buildings, each one is unique. It has its own set of opportunities and constraints, and really for us, refining the brief and clarifying the brief at the start was about testing our ideas against all of those themes that were identified in the sustainable development brief. And the upshot of this was a building where the vast majority of the fabric was retained between ground and 3rd floor. The 4th floor was rebuilt, and a new setback extension was created with a roof terrace above. Next slide, please. So I'll just talk about some of the key kind of design, environmental design features that we delivered on this project. It's been touched on already, but the landscape and biodiversity gain was really one of our key opportunities and key targets from the very start of this project. I think for us, architecturally and conceptually, we wanted to change the building's relationship with the street. It had it had a kind of retaining wall and some very bland planters that were really poor quality and kind of you know, just acted as a barrier to the public realm, between the public realm and the building. And we were interested in making a much more kind of permeable garden space that feels like it's part of the street and benefits that streetscape. Also, as Will touched on, the River Tyneborn, which is Thames tributary, runs directly under the site. And we worked with the landscape architects Todd Langscarf Gowan to develop a design that communicated some of that flow of water under the site in the design of the planters that you can see there today. And also, given the building's location, we took some inspiration from the Chelsea flower, showing kind of the sculptural nature of some of the planters and the specimen trees that we've ultimately installed in that ground floor garden. At roof level, the building benefits from some really spectacular views, particularly kind of south and east across London. So we created a really cool new terrace space with a big mixture of planting that includes lots of different types of herbs and strawberries that we very much hope that the tenant will be able to use and cook with in the future, along with an outdoor bar area that they can use for events. And then the green walls that you can see in these images were very much kind of used as a kind of vertical corridor that linked that ground floor and roof space as a kind of continuous kind of nature treatment to the building. And then this obviously has a magnificent kind of net biodiversity gain and significantly creates a significantly greener space than was there before. Next slide, please. So another really important aspect of the design is material reuse and use of materials with a high recycled content. Will's talked about the steelwork, which was kind of one of the key innovations for us on the scheme. But in addition to that, we worked really hard in the landscaping that I've just talked about. So we constructed all of the planters out of reclaimed Staffordshire Blue bricks, and all of the York stone that was on the ground plane outside is all reclaimed from a churchyard in Derbyshire, I believe it was. The raised access flooring, there was no raised access floor zone in the building previously. We had to remove the top layer of screed to create a floor zone. So the raised access flooring, which is responsible for a huge amount of, really disproportionate amount of embodied carbon on as one of our kind of architectural elements, was all reused from another site. The building has Adaptivate breather lime plaster and board throughout, which is a plant-based breathable alternative to traditional dry lining. And we obviously retain the vast majority of the facade and structure, as you've already seen. So these measures helped us achieve an embodied carbon figure of 300 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared, which is obviously well below the 500 kilogram LETI target. Next slide, please. In terms of fabric upgrades and climate resilience, again, this was another kind of theme that was very high up on the agenda for us. The existing facade was kind of an interesting proposition. It had around 50 millimeters of insulation in the existing cavity, 50 millimeters of 1980s insulation, and numerous kind of cold bridge details, particularly with kind of concrete sills and lintels that were spanning across the void. So we undertook extensive upgrades to that, including backfilling the cavity with high performance insulation. And then internally we wrapped the facade, not entirely, but in the areas where we had the cold bridges, particularly with a blanket of aerogel insulation, which really helped remove those cold bridges, and it has a very thin buildup, but a very high thermal performance. So we were able to do that internally without kind of massively eating into the net lettable area internally. So this, along with the replacement windows, kind of drastically upgraded the thermal performance of the building. And then at roof level, again, there is that kind of that risk with CLT and waterproofing, but we got a very robust solution there, and installed a blue roof across the entire area of the new roof, so that along with the green roofs that are also up there, drastically reduces surface water runoff, in the expectation that we will encounter more extreme weather events in the future. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'll just touch on the environmental strategy. So the building uses a mixed mode approach, so that occupiers have control of their own environment, which is something we feel is really important, but also so that the building obviously doesn't use power unnecessarily when fresh air can be provided directly from outside. All the windows are openable and have sensors that are linked back to an air quality monitor via the BMS. And when those sensors tell you that the air quality is sufficiently good for the windows to be opened, there's a little LED sensor on the wall that illuminates and tells the occupiers that they should open windows to save energy. And then in addition to this, we exposed all of the concrete soffits on the retained floors, so that we had as much thermal mass as possible on those floor plates to aid cooling and temperature regulation of the internal environment. So I'll just sum up with a few more images as well. Next slide, please. So yeah, there we have the existing before and after. You can see the this is from the main approach from Sloane Square, and you can see the additional extension and the green walls and some of the kind of limited facade interventions that we made to the scheme. Next slide, please. This is just looking back the other way up Holbein Place. Next slide, please. I think it was incredibly important to us that we provide that we didn't compromise on delivering the very highest quality office space. So I think this is the top floor, and I think we have achieved that. You know, on this floor we were able to deliver floor to ceiling height windows, a column-free flexible floor plate, and direct access to terrace space, which is, you know, some of the most spectacular office space that we've done. Next slide, please. And then, you know, there's still some real quality in the floor plates. Just changing the windows and getting that light transmittance up through the glass has had a massive impact on those spaces. Next slide, please. And then finally, the roof terrace and the terrace at the 5th floor again. That's me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was a really nice final presentation. So now we'll bring our speakers together for a panel discussion. So I'd like to also welcome Neil Henderson, who's partner at Gerald Eve. So Neil, I'm hoping you can kick us off. I'd love to hear from your perspective as the planning consultant, in what ways did Holbein Gardens pioneer circular principles, surpassing the aspirations of the Kensington and Chelsea Planning Authority?
Thanks, Nicola. Probably the first thing to say is nothing in KNC is straightforward, because it has such an active local resident population, and it's very politically charged. But from a planning point of view, the application was relatively straightforward. There was some design issues, but nothing particularly tricky to resolve. Fortunately, we did have bar gazetters on board. There was height issues, but we were able to resolve those. In terms of circular principles, what was interesting was that the application was determined in December 2020. And at that time, while the principles of circular economy were coming through in planning, actually many authorities were behind the curve on this policy, and actually generally didn't really understand the principles of circular economy and how to apply those. So in RBKC, while reusing the building certainly wasn't a negative, it wasn't really given the weight in the decision-making process that it perhaps would do today. And I suppose that's probably the most interesting point here, because at that time, in the case of Holbein Place, it was the market that had started to drive this principle harder than perhaps planning policy. Yes, I'm sure a dramatic rise in the construction costs was playing its part, favouring reuse rather than rebuild. But I certainly think from Grosvenor and many developers' points of view in the industry, they were beginning to recognise the importance that tenants were placing on sustainability credentials in the buildings they were wanting to occupy. So I think you know, without wishing to talk down my part, I think the point of how Holbein Place drove forward, or was perhaps pioneering, is the fact that it was a moment that certainly I recognised the industry were ahead of the game on planning, and planning has obviously since caught up. There has been momentum on planning policy and the recognition that reuse rather than rebuild is a priority. But that was really the moment when I really saw it in practice.
That's great. Thank you, Neil. I think you've answered my next question quite well, which is about whether the move towards sustainable and circular building practices is being driven by the market, the planning authorities, or the built environment industry. So that was really useful. I think next I'll ask, based on the experience in Holbein Gardens, what criteria do you think should inform whether a building is demolished or retrofitted? Philip, I wonder if you could weigh in on that one.
Right, I was concentrating so much on the mute button, I didn't. Can you just do that one again?
Sorry, yes, of course. So based on your experience of Holbein Gardens, what criteria do you think should inform whether a building is demolished or retrofitted?
It is a complex question there, and it's got more complex through the course of this year. And I think the sort of core factors at play would include the heritage environment, if indeed it exists in the heritage environment, but the heritage environment, where it is in terms of its local situation and its sort of macro position in terms of the economic benefits that that building could bring, whether it be new or reuse. The credibility of the financial business case, because frankly, if there isn't sufficient return in any of those options, then nothing's going to happen. And I think, of course, we're lucky with many of the areas in which we operate in London, but that isn't across the board in London, and that isn't across the board in the rest of the country, where we need to talk about regeneration projects and renewal projects to create great places to support communities. And then, of course, there is the environmental aspect, and the arguments that swing for and against with that. So, part of the industry is sort of, I guess, crying out for more standardization around certain things so that we can measure and contrast and compare more easily. And certainly environmental sustainability is one of those aspects.
Yeah. Thank you, Philip. Now we've got some great questions coming in from the audience. So I'd just like to highlight one of those, which is what were the significant barriers to overcome regarding the reuse of steel? For example, the warranties, the CE marking, the condition appraisal, selection, and so on. So Will, I wonder if you could weigh in on that one for us.
Yeah, sure. So regarding warranties and CE marking on this project, Cleveland was kind of a service that Cleveland Steel are able to provide. So steel would, they obviously have their own steel in stock, but also the steel from Grosvenor's sites, we'd send samples to Cleveland. They test it, they kind of pull it and test it. And from that, they're able to provide a CE marking. There was also a point in the question about kind of inspection, I think. And so my colleague Rob and I would go to all of the Grosvenor sites and inspect the steel visually, check it was kind of free of defects and rust and that kind of thing. And I think between those two things, if you've got a piece of steel that's CE marked and you've got a structural engineer telling you that it's suitable for use, I think that's going to satisfy any kind of insurer or building control or anyone like that. One thing to note with reused steel, there's this kind of informal cutoff of 1970, which is basically when oversight of steel production kind of ramped up and quality control of steel construction improved in this country. So generally, if you're looking to reuse steel, it wants to be manufactured after 1970, which actually discounted a bit of a lot of steel that Grosvenor had on one of their jobs because it was older than that. Another thing that is often unfortunate is you get steel frames which have been encased in concrete, and you've got to pay someone to chip off all that concrete, and steel sometimes gets damaged in that process. So that can also kind of be a bit of a spanner in the works. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Will. We've got another good one from the audience, which is, I'm going to push to Jonathan, which is, which of the circular economy principles had the steepest learning curve for the design team and contractors to implement?
I mean, I guess because of the timing of this project, there was a lot of issues around procurement and availability of materials that I think we hadn't really factored into kind of the design. So there were various instances where we had specified a product. We'd done our kind of due diligence beforehand, and we knew there was, like, the right amount of brickwork was out there, but then kind of during COVID, that brickwork had either the companies kind of weren't operating, or whatever happened, and so that brickwork just wasn't available anymore. So I think in that kind of material reuse area, the kind of the amount of time it takes to source some of these materials, and making sure that the quantity is available, perhaps having to set aside and kind of pay a deposit on some materials to make sure that they're available kind of at the point at which you need them, is kind of a really important thing to think about.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. So now I would like to ask Philip, what range of skills are required to retrofit buildings of this typology? And from your perspective, is London's workforce equipped to deliver similar projects at scale and the pace needed?
I think London workforce, I think it is equipped, but we're all on a learning journey, and we're in the early part of that learning journey. So I don't think everyone, very few people have got all of the answers, and the collective team with the right skills and attitude and the right partnerships between owners and managers and local planning authorities and occupiers in a collaborative way can help us get there. And getting there in the office sector is creating new and progressive workplace, so that we retain workers in buildings and areas, and those areas become attractive to people to operate in, because that is pretty fundamental. Connectivity, amenity, all of those things, and all of the great workplace elements that Jonathan has talked to. And environmental becomes part of that. You sort of can't have, it's difficult to have one without the other. And then the range of skills is again fairly complex. All of these things, as I said before, can get very technical very quickly. So we're all on that learning journey, but I don't see the industry doing it badly at all. And as Neil said, I think the industry, as it's done before in other areas of work, stepped up over the last sort of 5 years to react to climate change, to see what it could do. But certainly training, management support, great employees, people that want to do better, they are the soft skills as well as the hard skills that we're all trying to improve on. I don't know if the rest of the team have got any thoughts on that. I'll leave that to you, Nicola.
Sure. Well, anyone would like to weigh in on that question, please do unmute yourself. No, we'll jump to the next one. Got another great one from the audience, which is I think for Neil, I think, is there a shortage in planning authorities of people who can do a real assessment of circular proposals?
Yeah, I saw this one. I think, I mean, there's a shortage of resource generally, as we know. Specialist resource, definitely. You can be lucky with some authorities and they have good sustainability or energy officers. K&C has got a very good sustainability and energy officer, but even those people will struggle with to deal with the complexity. You know, we've been talking about the complexity and the level of technical understanding you have to have on some of these very specialist areas of work. And I think it's fair to say that things like peer review analysis of circular economy reports are going to become more and more common as the push to really understand whether developers and investors have really tested the extent to which reuse is possible rather than redevelop. I think more and more it will become like viability assessments where the applicant has to pay for the council to get outside resource to review their own work in order to get, you know, a proper and fair assessment of the issue. So yeah, I think there is a shortage. I think it will evolve over time. There is more and more knowledge coming into the sector, but many authorities won't have the volume of projects needed to sustain an officer. So it's more likely that the applicant's going to have to pay for this resource to come in.
Great, thank you, Neil. Question for you, Will. So in the context of Brexit and the pandemic, how did you address the challenges of the materials and skills shortages to deliver the project?
Good question. I think Brexit, I think it was like materials in particular. I mean, it was a consideration for the project, but I don't think it like had any major impacts on program or delivering the project from like a technical or practical point of view. I think the PM in particular probably deserves, and between them and the contractor Benham House deserve good credit for that. I think they saw supply chain issues coming and were able to generally not let them hold up the project. I think Jonathan probably will know a bit, but speak a bit more about the non-structural side of things. He alluded earlier to kind of sourcing some bits of like reclaimed materials. I think were challenging, and making sure those were secured in the right quantity at the right time was a challenge. But I think overall the supply chain issues with Brexit didn't have a huge impact on the project or program. It was managed.
I think ultimately we were able to source the materials that we want, but you know, some of the lead times were becoming, you know, that's where the problems came in. And you know, at that point in the world, you know, there wasn't a huge amount that you could really do about that. You know, it was just like the contractor just had to use their kind of purchasing power to get everything as quickly as possible.
Thank you both. We did have a question come in saying, what material database did you use to find the tiles and other materials we used in the landscaping, and how did you go about finding these? Jonathan, I wonder if you could answer that for us.
I mean, the answer is we didn't use a database. You know, we just had to go out there and talk to people and talk to suppliers and use the landscape architects' contacts. You know, there isn't, I don't think, a satisfactorily kind of detailed database of materials at this point in time. So, you know, we just had to go out there and research it and speak to people.
Thank you. I'd like to direct this question, I guess, to everyone in the panel. So the question being, how has the policy landscape and focus on circularity shifted since work began on Holbein Gardens? And what next steps do we think are needed to meet ambitions for reducing that operational carbon and embodied carbon in London's built environment? Philip, I wonder if you could lead that one for us.
Yeah, so I guess the policy landscape over the Holbein period is sort of shifting, or it has moved, and as I said before, I think it probably needs a lot of understanding from all of us, and it becomes very site specific, very building specific. And so what we would sort of ask for there is good advice and good conversations around it. And back to the planning aspects, with the GLA on larger projects and with local planning authorities and the local skills within local planning those local planning authorities, then it's that dialogue that we'd want to have at a really early stage, and whether that comes through pre-application advice, which can sometimes be slow, and it's kind of in written form. It's not always enabling a dialogue, a workshop, those sorts of things, to understand what those key principles are. So I think more dialogue, and again, better understanding would help.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. Neil, I wonder your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier. The more specialist knowledge is needed. The policy has moved on. I think in fact, I don't think it's even the policy has moved on. I think it's the awareness of the issue has moved on. The politics has definitely moved on. We were obviously aware of very high profile issues, Oxford Street, M&S, and so forth. But so there is definitely a political recognition that has put this right up the agenda, and I think that is really going to force applicants to push harder and test harder on what strategy they are approaching, whether it's reuse or rebuild, and the extent to which that strategy has been tested to destruction to a certain extent. Have they proved that it is absolutely the right solution from a circular economy point of view? And that's where both the applicant and the local authority will want to ensure that they've been guided by specialist advice for both parties.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Will, I suppose from the engineering perspective, what do you think those next steps are?
With circular economy, I think getting the whole design team on board, getting early input from a contractor, it's not the most exciting answer, but I think probably holds true. Specifically for things like reusing steel, just repeatedly going out and seeing what is available, which I alluded to in my presentation. So what might not be available at REBA stage 2 or 3 might become available at REBA stage 5, and having that flexibility within your design to kind of capitalize on that. That mainly.
Thank you, Will. And Jonathan, any thoughts from your side as well?
I think the data sharing and knowledge transfer is a big thing in terms of moving this whole conversation forward. And by doing panels like this is what we're trying to share our experience. And I think hopefully in doing that, it can inform, and it's just a constant kind of cycle of improvement and better understanding that our industry kind of needs to move forward on this topic.
Yeah, Brilliant. Thank you, Jonathan. Now we've just about come to time. I noticed we've had quite a few technical questions come in from the audience. So if any of you are happy to stick around and just type those answers, I'm sure everyone will be greatly appreciative. But we'll bring our panel discussion to a close. And I'm sure I join us all in thanking our speakers for these very engaging presentations this morning on such an interesting and successful project. So thank you all very much for coming this morning and speaking. To our audience, a reminder to have a look on our website for upcoming events. We have our next webinar, Conservation Conversations, exploring the challenges and opportunities of restoration will be taking place at London to book onto that. We will now load a short poll for you to give us some feedback on the session, which is very, very useful for us for planning future events. So please do take a moment to fill that out. But aside from that, we very much hope you enjoyed our discussion, and we look forward to seeing you all again at the next webinar. And thank you to our speakers and thank you to our audience for joining us.